Let's go to Senate Armed Services Committee Ranking Member, Democratic, Senator Jack Reed. Senator, good to have you.
Thank you, Neil.
So what do you think? Should there be a third meeting or not?
Well, I think the negotiation process, the diplomacy should continue, but I think what's critical right now is to reestablish the maximum pressure campaign to make sure that the North Koreans understand that we're willing to talk, but we're also willing to put pressure on their regime. That will require ensuring that China and the other regional powers cooperate with us, but that's the next real step of reapplying the pressure. If they come back to the table, they'll come back to the table willing to deal, not just for the sake of photo op.
You know, Senator, there are a lot of people making a big deal of the president walking away from this. Of course, Ronald Reagan walked away at Reykjavik and Iceland back in 1985, came back to secure a better deal, if you think about it. John F. Kennedy, as a new incoming president, had a rough first meeting with Nikita Khrushchev. I think it's fair to say that a little more than a year and a half later, he had righted that ship with a very strong response during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I'm wondering if we're prejudging this. What's your sense of where this puts the president on the global stage?
Well, I think there's two critical mistakes that were made. Despite the great work of the Special Envoy Steve Biegun to set the meeting up, there was no detailed listing of the nuclear sites and the nuclear facilities that are really the heart of our discussions. Typically for a meeting, and President Reagan had many meetings with Gorbachev, but they went in with pretty detailed sort of, if you will, guidelines or pathways that they were going to pursue. They didn't have this in this case. And the second mistake is in Singapore, President Trump, I think, sent the signal to Kim Jong-un that this is all going to be a one-on-one private conversation. You can ask me and I'll give it to you, particularly with respect to our military exercises. When the president conceded off the cuff that we would not have military exercises, in fact, described them as provocative war exercises, I think that sent the wrong signal to Kim Jong-un. I think he said, I don't need this preliminary negotiation. I'm just going to sit down with him. I'm going to ask him to take off sanctions. He'll probably do it. And so the setting was all wrong.
But he miscalculated, right? I mean, it's fair to say he miscalculated. What I'm wondering, Senator, and you're closer to this than I am, but is there a sense you have that maybe there's confusion within the North Korean leadership, that they say, for example, that they didn't ask for dropping all sanctions, just some, and then set the stage, quid pro quo, to remove others? We don't know. What we do know is, to your point, no deal was made.
Right.
Do you think if there were to be a future meeting, that should be outlined and almost signed off on before either leader goes to wherever they go?
Oh, absolutely. I think, again, successful summits are generally just a ratification of a pretty defined deal by the leaders, not let's talk about some topics that are interesting or important, et cetera.
But things change, right? Someone tries to zoom the other or embarrass the other. That we learned that with John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev. We learned that with Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. So How do you prepare for that?
Well, I think when, your comment with the President Kennedy, when he met Khrushchev in Vienna, it was, he assumed, more of a get-to-know-you meeting, and
Absolutely.
Khrushchev sort of turned it on its head. When Reagan and Gorbachev met, they had a pretty well-defined sort of spectrum. Gorbachev and Reagan were ready really to announce kind of a going to zero in terms of nuclear weapons.
But Gorbachev, if I remember, sir, suddenly threw in there, by the way, whatever you're doing with this Star Wars defense initiative, that's got to stop. And that was just like a paragraph added at the last second, and Reagan bolted. But you're quite right. There's a difference here. But how do you avoid that?
Well, you avoid it by doing the preliminary work. Again, it goes to my first point. Had there been something that looked like an outline, a detailed outline of agreements or at least points of disagreement, and the president knew that, and his team was meeting in a structured way to deal with them, that's a lot different than sitting down one-on-one and sort of, let's talk about a deal. What do you want? You've got to avoid that to get any type of comprehensive agreement. The next step, as I suggested, is we've got to get this this maximum pressure campaign, because if the North Koreans walk away thinking, you know, they've won, that they're now a recognized nuclear power. They've met twice with the President of the United States. Kim Jong-un is a world leader. Nothing can take him off that pedestal, and gradually they will see the sanctions regime begin to erode. Then they've won, and frankly, that would be unfortunate.
All right. Well, we're not at that point yet, but we'll watch it very closely. Senator Jack Reed, great seeing
Thanks,
you.
Neil.
Thank you, sir.